Hello, and welcome to my series ARC101. My name is Lily. Today we are discussing common architectural terminologies, anywhere from the academic deliverables to the 5 phases of design. Oh my God, I should really give credit to actors to be able to maintain their accents, because Lord jeez, I can't do it. So I wanted to make this series of videos focused on the academic level of architecture, specifically for anybody who's in high school considering doing architecture as a career, or somebody who's already in academic architecture and wants a bit of a refresher. But I also want to kind of make further videos that are career-oriented. So having been at 2 construction/architecture firms and now going to my 3rd one, I have a little bit of experience and a little bit of advice that I would love to be able to relay to people. So all that advice on just general career advice about being an intern, maybe about being a Black woman in architecture profession, all that stuff will come later. But right now we're going to talk about terminology. So the first set of words are words that you will hear at every and all levels of architecture. So the first term is Parti, and a Parti is your general concept or guiding idea behind your design. And in undergrad, I was taught that your Parti should fit in either one sentence, spoken sentence, or in a very easily understood graphic. And there are architecture firms like Bjarke Ingels Group, who are known for doing these simple yet very descriptive diagrams that are basically their Parti. So you can see in this image that Big shows this simple massing of their building, West 57. In this image, you see that by doing 3 simple modifications to a rectangular structure, creating a courtyard, lengthening the heights of different corners, and then creating perforations for windows, they easily design this building. So the next word is massing, and massing is basically the overall size and scale of your building in relation to its surroundings. So imagine taking your design, throwing a tablecloth over it, and then kind of like sucking the air out of it. That would be your massing. Your massing isn't detailed. All it's supposed to show is how the size of the building and the scale of the proportions of your building relate to each other and relate to the overall site. So envelope describes the exterior walls of your building. It is what the materials are and how it's designed. So you need to consider, obviously, climatic conditions, whether you're in a site that's snowy, rainy, high temperature, low temperature, whether you can have windows open or not, or how much sunlight you'll end up getting. Those are all considerations when doing envelope design. But in real life, you also have to kind of worry about codes and rules in a specific site. So now program. Program or programs are specific activities that happen within the space. And you can see, for example, the Halifax Central Library, which is one of my favorite libraries. Obviously, the program is educational because it's a library. But within the actual library, there are different purposes and different activities happening on every floor, and the space is designed accordingly. Intervention is basically just another word for your design. What you're adding to the site or what you're taking away is your intervention, how you're intervening and how you're adjusting the site for your specific purposes or based on your Parti. So now we'll talk about typical architecture student deliverables. And deliverables basically means the set of products you have to produce for your professor or your critic. So your typical academic deliverables usually include a diagram, site plan, floor plan, section, elevation, detail, perspective, and model. So diagrams are graphics that summarize your design and further to help paint your story. And like in the case of Bjarke Ingels Group, they might produce one principal graphic, like the one that I showed, that would be their Parti, but they also like to produce multiple diagrams that might talk about sunlight or ventilation or people walking through their spaces or egress. The point of the diagram is that it needs to be, above all, easily understood, and you should be able to look at it and get the idea of your project. A site plan is a top view of your design with a little bit of the surrounding area. And the scale of the site plan really depends on what your intervention is. So in the case of this image, the SANAA building, Grace Farms, it has such a large extent because the intervention includes landscape design. likely, if it was only the building that they were intervening with, the site plan would probably be a lot smaller and more focused. Now, a plan or a floor plan is a top view of each floor of your design, usually taken as a horizontal cut about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. So you'll cut through things like windows and doors, but not furniture and definitely not people. Don't make that mistake. An elevation is a frontal view of your design from the cardinal directions, so north, east, south, or west, that is supposed to show how your building size relates to the surroundings, and also things like your envelope design and where your entrances and exits are. So a section is essentially an elevation, but is cutting through your building vertically. So you'll be able to see details like how your walls meet your roof and your floor, and also show somewhat of a relationship between spaces inside your building. And instead of an elevation where it's usually 4 views, a section is typically 2 views, cutting at perpendicular angles, because what you see on this side is usually the same thing seen on the other side reflected. If you're designing an atypical building, obviously, you can show more views. You shouldn't be afraid to show more sections. It just has to make an impact, and it has to serve a purpose. It has to show something different that you're not going to see in the other section anyway. Now, a detail is exactly that. It is a zoomed in view of a specific part of your building. So that might be a wall section detail that shows, your layers of drywall, insulation, and your structural members. It might be a detail into your floor or roof structure, or it might be a specific mechanism that you designed. It's very cool to be able to produce detailed drawings at the academic level before graduate. I think that's just a really plus that a lot of profs and critics really appreciate, because it shows that you've understood and you're thought about how your building's actually coming together. So finally, perspective/render. And I use this a little bit interchangeably, because when somebody thinks render, they automatically think created by computer software. And then when they think perspective, they kind of typically think either hand-drawn or collage or whatever. But the point is, this is your 3D representation of the interior or exterior of your space to show how somebody in that space would feel. And in my opinion, it's also really depends on your own style, how you want to represent something interior. It could be a collage, it could be digitally rendered, it could be a really well done sketch. Whatever the case, it needs to communicate how a person in that space would feel and what they would experience. So if your project Parti is really about sunlight and brightness and airiness, then your representation, your perspective, needs to communicate sunlight and brightness. If it's about a cave-like feeling, your perspective or render needs to be dark and crowded. It needs to really be consistent. So finally, a model is a scale representation of your design, and you might be asked by your prof to produce either a sectional or partial model that shows the intricacies of your design within, or a massing model, like I described, which is just a general shape and size of your building in relation to the surrounding, or even a detailed model, which might be like a wall section that shows your drywall, your insulation, your structural members, and just how certain parts of your building are produced and come together. I will make sure and make a video about scales when it comes to model making, and a bunch of tips that I've picked up from model making in a couple later videos. So now I'm going to shift to some terms that are less common in the academic level, but way more common in the professional level, but still just really good to know. And I'm actually summarizing a video by Jorge Fontan. I've included the link to his video in the description, but he essentially goes over the 5 phases of design, including pre-design and a couple more terms, in his video in much more detailed fashion. So the initial step in architectural design is known as pre-design, and that's essentially your research gathering phase. So you do your background site research, you look into zoning, you look into codes, you look into your specific project scope, you formulate your project teams, etc. This is integral to any design project when it comes to professional, obviously, and you're using all these different terms, but definitely precedent study and background site research are very important at the academic level. So make sure you do that before you even start your design. Now, the actual phases of the architectural design process are schematic design, SD, design development, DD, construction documents, CD, bidding, and construction administration, CA. So the first phase, schematic design, is where you establish your concept, direction of the project, massing and size, general floor plans, general elevations, models and renderings, and start to consider what the building is basically made up. So you might even start producing wall sections. In design development, you further develop what hasn't been designed in SD. That might be things like discussing with your consultant about heating and air conditioning and electrical, or thinking about designing the interior, or designing lighting, or very importantly, material finishes. So now we have CD, construction documents, and this is a step where you start to produce your filing set and then go on to produce your full drawing set, which your general contractor will use to actually build your building. And this is what essentially also leads to getting your permits for construction. The second to last phase is bidding. And what happens in this phase is that the client and the architecture will interview contractors and see who is capable and willing to produce the work that they want, give them quotes, and also respond to RFIs, which is response for information, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the final phase is construction administration, and this is all the work that's done while your building's being built. And at times, even though you're in its own discrete phase, CA, there might be instances where, say, something's not fully designed or not fully developed, or there's just questions about how something happens. There might be parts within this phase that might go to SD or DD and require further design. But this is all the work that's happening while literally ground is being broken to the time that it's completed. So now I will define scope, RFIs, and change orders. So scope is the specific area that you or your firm is working on and all the tasks you need to complete to get your scope completed. And for instance, a project that might have 2 architecture teams working on it, one team might have a scope that's only to do with the public spaces, and then the other team might have a scope that's to do with all the private spaces and back of house. An RFI, like I mentioned, means request for information, and that's basically anybody like the contractor or any of the consultants, interior design, structure, etc., or even the client that will reach out to the architect and request information on drawings that they see that might be missing something or something's just very unclear. And finally, change order. So a change order is something that happens during the actual building process, and it might be issued by an architect, a constructor, or one of the clients or a consultant, where an issue like budget or something that needs clarification or the client or the problem might come up, and it requires the architect to actually go back and change parts of the design. So that is it for architecture terminology. I'm sure I've missed a few, but there might be a chance that I might make further videos on this subject. I do want to continue to make this a series and talk about modeling techniques, talk about scales, talk about common architectural conventions, and that kind of thing. So please stay tuned for those. But thank you. Thank you for filling in for my video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was very helpful for you. And I hope to see you back in another one. Goodbye. I did the little thing.